Welcome to the IAPP web conference, Marketing and Consumer Experience Perspectives to Enhance Your Privacy Program, brought to you today by Ketch. My name is Jen Clark. I'm a programming specialist here at the IAPP, and I will be acting as your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, I'd like to cover a few program details. First, a little housekeeping. As you may have noticed when you entered the Zoom broadcast, your participant audio and video will be disabled for the duration of this program. The Q&A function is accessible at the bottom of your screen, and that is the best method to use to ask questions of today's presenters. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals who are the named registrants with 1 IAPP CPE credit. Others who are listening in can apply for those credits through an easy-to-use online form on our website. We'd also like to remind you again that today's program is being recorded. The recording, along with a PDF download of today's presentation slides, will be available free to registered attendees within 48 hours following the live event. You can find the recording as well as the link to download the presentation in the My Purchases section of your My IAPP online profile. Again, we encourage you to ask questions at any time during the program by using the Q&A function that you can access in the toolbar at the bottom of your viewing window. We'll be answering your questions as time allows during this presentation. And now on to our program. I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Jonathan Joseph is the Chief Marketing Officer at Ketch. And at this point, Jonathan, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Hey, Jen, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. It's a hot topic, and I'm super proud to be joined here with Ariel Garcia, who's the Chief Privacy Officer at Universal McCann. Maybe you've heard of them, one of the biggest media agencies in the world. Steph Liu is a privacy and marketing analyst at Forrester. She's written a ton of research on the intersection of consumer experience and marketing with privacy. And so we're keen to dig into how marketing and consumer experience perspectives can help privacy programs, and kind of the aim of this is to arm you with some tips and tricks and thinking behind how marketing thinks about privacy and how to engage marketing teams a little more. Ariel, do you want to go first and say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Ariel Garcia. I'm UM's Chief Privacy Officer. I also lead our privacy task force across our parent network media brands. I am actually on the business side. So I am not a lawyer and not acting as one in my role. And the reason that my role is on the business side is intentional. It's very aligned to our view that privacy is a business imperative. And so a big part of what I do in my role is help our clients navigate the very rapidly evolving and dynamic space.
Thanks, Ariel. You know, I'm not a lawyer either, but I love giving legal advice. You might hear some during this presentation. Steph, do you mind saying a few words?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph Liu. I'm an analyst at Forrester Research. So I work with our clients primarily in the B2C marketing space to break down what different privacy laws mean from a marketing perspective, as well as diving into things like consumer privacy trends, how they are protecting their privacy and what those implications are for things like marketing and advertising.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Ariel. So let's get to it. We're going to talk about marketing consumer perspectives on privacy. 3 big themes here. 1, there's brand value around privacy for consumers. Consumer awareness is on the rise. We'll talk a little about that. The consumer experience of privacy, I mean, obviously hugely important. For marketing, you know, for decades, they've carefully curated consumer experiences and now carefully curated consumer experiences in digital. But now we have this privacy banner showing up a lot of the time, being a little disruptive to that. So that and more, how do we think about consumer experience within the privacy experience? And lastly, we all know marketers care about data, they care about growth. How do we reconcile data utilization and using data to grow the business with privacy initiatives? We'll do some Q&A at the end, and of course, we'll take questions throughout, and if they're relevant to kind of where we are, we'll address those. So feel free to throw those into the chat. So let's get started. So this slide is meant to be a little provocative, right? I don't think marketers are anti-privacy necessarily, as this kind of Ad Age article is suggesting. But we do think that marketing teams need to be involved a little more than perhaps they are today with some privacy initiatives. And the subtitle here in this Ad Age article really says it, right? It's the future of marketing is data, and how do you reconcile data with privacy? Ariel, you're engaging with marketing teams all the time and privacy teams. What do you see? What's your perspective here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I certainly don't think that it's a matter of brands being anti-privacy. And my other point of contention with this particular positioning in this headline is that it seems to imply that data is inherently anti-privacy, right? And that's not the case at all. Privacy is not about eliminating the use of data. It's about driving the responsible use of data and responsible use that's transparent to people and gives them choice and is fair from their perspective. And so to that point, brands are definitely embracing ideas, right? So for example, brands are increasingly thinking about how to leverage engaging content in new ways to build that deeper consumer relationship, a relationship that, you know, inspires customers to want to hear from them. And so the analogy I use to describe the dynamic that we find ourselves in and that brands find themselves in is that there's kind of this game of Scrabble meets Battleship that's happening, right? And so brands and that, you know, on the marketing side, but also on the privacy side, they're needing to parse through these new laws, new changes by big tech, new regulatory guidance, new enforcement activity, and they need to figure out how to not get caught in the crosshairs, and also how to sustain their growth, right? And so while marketers are working on one side of that coin, right? They're working on future-proofing their ability to drive growth. Privacy teams are figuring out how to navigate those evolving requirements. And so it's not that there's a lack of concern for privacy. It's more about the need to bridge those conversations and the opportunities that can arise from tighter integration and collaboration between those groups. Because at the end of the day, it's solving for two sides of the same coin, which is how do you meet evolving consumer expectation as codified by regulators around transparency, choice, and data use.
Yeah, well said, Ariel. I mean, we like to say privacy is a team sport. Obviously, IT, tech is involved, legal obviously involved. Marketing should jump in from a data perspective, consumer experience perspective. Steph, from your perch, how do you see this marketing team's involvement in privacy initiatives?
Yeah, I agree with Ariel. I have an issue with this positioning as privacy and data as being opposite ends of the spectrum. When I'm talking to marketers, they understand that consumer privacy concerns are real, and because their job is to reach consumers and engage with them, they're not going to say, you know, we're just going to completely ignore that entirely and therefore be anti-privacy. The real questions are, how do we respect consumers' privacy while, you know, trying to serve them personalized experiences, for example? What are the right kinds of data to use to shape that experience, and how do we personalize without being creepy? Those are the kinds of conversations I'm having with marketers. So I understand Ad Age is trying to get those eyes on this article, but I think this is just I think it's an inaccurate representation of how marketers are thinking about privacy today.
Good, because that's, you know, it's exactly what we're trying to unpack today. You know, for me, it comes down to the value exchange, right, with consumers. And I think with marketing and consumers, they've always understood that there's some value exchange behind advertising. You give me content, you give me something that delights me. And now maybe it's an exchange of data that facilitates that. So this idea, I love how you pitched that, Ariel, that data and privacy can be two sides of the same coin, I think is important. So let's dig into that a little bit. The first topic we said we'd address is this idea of values. And so around values, you know, marketing has always wanted to align and build some shared values with their consumers, right, for the longest time. And we're starting to see that recently in things like sustainable supply chains, in organic food. And one of the questions that I ask myself is, you know, where does privacy rank in relation to those? Like how important is privacy as a value to consumers? You see some of the research out there saying, look, 1 in 5 consumers avoid a brand, right, because of their data practices. Half of Americans haven't used a product because of privacy concerns. Ariel, I'll go to you first. Is there a trend in a certain direction around how privacy is valued by consumers? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, at this point, it's fairly clear that people are concerned about their privacy, and that trust is fractured. And the reason for that, you alluded to it before, this idea of like the value exchange, and fundamentally people understood it, but at some point along the way, that value exchange became unfair from people's perspective, and so that trend is what we're seeing play out now, and the need to repair it. And the example I like to use is, Apple's app tracking transparency rollout with iOS 14.5. When given a choice, people chose not to opt into tracking, right? And there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure it'll be part of our discussion today, but certainly people are showing through their actions that they do care about their privacy.
Steph, what do you think? I think I stole that line on organic food from you at some point. So any perspectives to share there? I'll send the royalties to the usual account, by the way.
I mean, I think one of the positive things of the Cambridge Analytica scandal is it did a great job at educating consumers on the extent of the data economy, of how an innocent Facebook quiz can actually feed your profile that is passed to companies that you've never heard of, and obviously didn't know were getting your data. And so because of that, we've seen multiple movements like the boycott Facebook movement. And so I think consumers are starting to understand, and I say this across the board, across generations and internet usage behavior, is that consumers understand more that their privacy is not necessarily something they can take for granted. And because of that, we are starting to see brands respond to that by trying to make privacy one of those corporate values, the same way that we do with, to JJ's point, like sustainability and environmental friendliness. The one caveat there is you need to be genuine. And if you're caught privacy washing, saying you're privacy friendly, but then throwing an exorbitant number of trackers on your website, for example, consumers will catch on to that and they will call you out.
Oh, thanks, Steph. Yeah, such a great point. Well, let's talk about consumer awareness then, since you brought that up. My view here is that it's increasing. I mean, partly because of regulatory activity, right? We're seeing laws drop. I mean, 6 new states, some folks are projecting in the US at least. A lot of media attention on data practices. And we'll talk about this a little later, but big tech basically battling, right, for data. We saw Facebook and Apple kind of at work. What the result of that was, right, with Facebook's drop in enterprise value. But what are some of the things that brands and privacy teams can do to address some of this, to build brand value? I mean, trust and transparency is one. Ariel, I'll go to you first. What are you seeing in terms of real tactical advice here on how we can address this?
Well, first, I would say, I just want to underscore what Stephanie said about authenticity, right? All of this really hinges on that need for these efforts to be authentic. Otherwise, it would have the opposite effect. But to that point, the first thing in my view is really that transparency, and how do you make that more human, right? Like, I love the Apple example again for this. So on the heels of that app tracking transparency rollout, you saw a number of app developers roll out these, explainer screens that try to educate people on how their information enables them to personalize or, provide some value back to the consumer in exchange for their information. And, I remember several years ago when the position was more of, well, ad tech data flows are complicated. Well, now we see the business case for figuring out how to articulate it to people and to bring them along and educate them so that they can make informed choices. So transparency and making those disclosures human and readable to the average person is foundational to their ability to make informed choices. And then the second side of that is give people meaningful choice. And that also has 2 kind of components to it, right? It's giving them choices, but also honoring those choices. And to honor those choices, from a technical standpoint, means that you need to work with your partners and understand how you're going to integrate with them and how you're going to orchestrate those preferences downstream, right? So it's really at its core about transparency and choice and making those meaningful and authentic.
So for example, I have a huge beef with cookie banners because they just don't make sense to me, right? Like I'm jumping onto a website, then it says, would you like Google Analytics to fire? I don't know what that means, right? So this idea that there's a transparency around what you're actually doing with data, right? So what we're doing is we're running analytics, here's why, or we're running targeting advertising, here's what you get out of it. By the way, when we collect your data, we're going to keep it for 180 days, or whatever the case may be. Full transparency over that. And to your point, Ariel, giving consumers control and choice over that. And then, I love this one, like do what you say you're going to do. I think generally the regulators, if there's an approach that isn't codified, but everyone kind of understands this is what they do, don't say to your point about being authentic, don't say you're doing something and give consumers choice and then don't orchestrate that downstream as an example. Like someone opts out to something, let's make sure they're opted out. And it's not just a facade, a Hollywood facade of opting out. Steph, what do you think? Any other kind of practical advice here?
Yeah, I would say brands should define what privacy means to them, what they want their privacy program to look like. There are some brands for whom compliance is the goal. And well, personally, I think that, that's the floor, not the ceiling. If that's your approach, then you can define what that means and all the trickle down effects. But if you want to go beyond compliance, if you want to start doing things like, trying to engender trust with your customers, then, that's a different ballgame. Compliance is the foundation of that, of course. But you have to start thinking about what Ariel was talking about here, the privacy experience and how you actually show those disclosures and word them in a way that is human understandable, not legalese. And there are a lot of choices there that businesses have to make. I talk to a lot of companies in in regulated industries who are much more conservative, and that's totally fine. But I think you should start by really defining the scope of your privacy program and how much you're willing to take it as a brand value, because there is a little bit of risk there involved, right? In being more transparent and actually trying to make privacy a differentiator. And as we said before, if you're going to go that route, first, I applaud you, but second, you need to be genuine and you need to be transparent about what that means.
Yeah, it's funny on that, Steph, like we're having a lot of conversations with clients about how and which rights they should offer. And what we're hearing a lot is, the regulations say X, you need to give people the right to opt out in California, and the right to delete. But would you really not offer that to somebody in New York when they're fully aware that Californians are getting it? And how weird would that be in terms of positioning? And so folks are asking some real questions about, the regulations say X, but that doesn't mean, that is the flaw, kind of like you said, right? We might want to think about what the consumer experience is here and their awareness of privacy and maybe equalize that and have some idea of global policy. Well, I promise you there won't be a lot of math in this presentation, but there's two parts we're going to dig into math. Well, one of the gaps we found is, how do you really value consumer awareness and brand value, right? It's hard to put a number to it, but we've done this recently with a top 100 retailer. But essentially, thinking back to some of those survey numbers where 1 in 5 consumers would leave if a company had bad data practices. We assume what it would be like for a top 100 retailer if only 1% of their customers left because of bad data practices. And in this example, 20 million people in the loyalty database, a 1% change is 200,000. With an annual order value of $250, that's $50 million out the door, right? And 1%, I think, is kind of conservative. We're seeing 1% in DSR rates, in data subject rights fulfillment. So 1% of perception of data practices, I think, is reasonable. To help level set this, it's about a 0.7% growth in revenue on 1%. I think it's much more than 1%. And of course, I think to your point, if this is a value, it's not revenue out the door. It could be an opportunity to increase revenue, right? And I think one of the ways to do that is, I don't know, maybe to be first. in doing this, right? As a brand, I mean, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's a benefit to being first, also because of the authenticity point, right? To take this proactive stance and to take a more proactive approach to offering people a greater ability to manage their preferences than what's required certainly has a benefit. I think, you know, when we think as privacy professionals about the way that we that there's a tendency to articulate ROI of privacy programs, there's big focus on risk mitigation and like cost of compliance mitigation. And I think, you know, as we think about how do you engage with your colleagues in marketing and how do you build that business case, it is important to capture that this is an opportunity as well. If you are first, if you do this right. And so, you know, as we move into the experience section, I'm sure we'll touch on this more, but there's a real opportunity to be had from integrating the way that we're thinking about preference management and the preference experience more holistically. And there's a benefit to that goes beyond the cost of compliance, certainly.
Yeah, this idea that privacy is an opportunity, that it's a growth engine, that it's a revenue player is super interesting and a good way to engage CRM teams, marketing teams. Well, let's talk about consumer experience. Steph, consumers are fed up. Can you help us establish a little baseline here? What's going on?
Sure. So this is some Forrester data I brought along, but essentially consumers know that we're collecting, that brands and websites are collecting their activities and information, but they don't like it. So 60% are not comfortable with companies sharing and selling their information. And over half of them will take active measures to limit the amount of data that is collected. So that means, you know, limiting things at a device setting level, blocking third-party cookies, et cetera. So generally, when I talk about privacy with marketers, you know, there's a lot of questions about what Apple's doing and what the latest is with third-party cookies, but I always bring it back to the consumer because we as marketers, and I tell this to marketers to their face, we kind of created this problem. Like we created ad retargeting that is too good, that is getting creepy. It's gotten to the point where a lot of consumers are convinced Facebook has hacked their phone microphones because there's just no way that their ad targeting can be that good, right? Like that is the extent, that is how good marketing has gotten. And we have in the process of, you know, personalization and hyper targeting have pretty much ignored what consumers actually want. And so, yes, it's easy to blame, you know, the privacy regulators, the big tech companies, but at the end of the day, consumers are the ones driving a lot of these changes. And I think it's so important to keep that piece in mind. And that carries through to when you're building these privacy experiences. Ariel touched on this earlier, making sure that they're human, you know, making sure that they're understandable, not to me as a privacy professional, not to you as a legal person, but, you know, to my mom, to a very typical consumer who is not knee deep in the inner workings of the GDPR, for example.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Steph, like what does it mean for privacy to be humanized, right? And I think you talk about that a lot. Like what are some good examples of that? I know we call it consent. It's such a weird name, right? Like, well, what's some practical advice to humanize it?
Yeah, so examples of that would be like not using legitimate interest when you're asking for permission, because again, outside of the legal and privacy world, like, most people don't know what that is. It's also in the way that you frame what you're doing with that data. So, you know, you can use the data processor or data controller language. It's not very user friendly. Instead, it's things like defining what personalization means. I saw a cookie banner where one of the layers of cookies that you could accept was comfort. And it was specifically, well, remember these things about your browsing history or your browsing session so that when you come back, you don't have to start over. And it was very explicit. Like in this case, it was a company from the travel industry. So we'll remember your last search. So if you want to try and rebook that flight, or if you want to poke around and see if the price has changed, you don't have to type in your dates of travel, your airports, etc. And it was very clear, and it used, that actual example to show this is what you get in the comfort layer. And again, if you're my mom, I think that's a lot more accessible than saying, we're going to use legitimate interest for these and these and these, and then share your data with third parties for these pieces and these pieces.
I love that, Steph. And Ariel, like, I think we can tie it back to, you could also use it as an opportunity to articulate your value, right? So what are some of your thoughts there, or best practices you've seen?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is a very exciting opportunity is to think about this more holistically, right? Like, instead of today where we have this disruptive cookie banner that is really disrupting an otherwise thoughtful experience, how do we make a more holistic experience by approaching this from like an integrated preference management standpoint, right? So for example, when someone is making their data choices and privacy choices, what if that's also the place where they express their communication preferences? What channels do they want to hear from the brand on? Like, also, hey, yeah, I would like to be reminded in 6 months to buy a replacement of this product. That would be helpful for me, right? Just kind of, not only does that create an experience that's more positive for the person, but it also makes it easier to understand how data is actually enabling personalization and why that personalization is valuable, right? Because part of this is about articulating the value exchange, but the other part of it is about making that value exchange compelling. And so, yes, the knowledge of what's happening, the transparency is foundational to articulating it, but how do you actually make this part of the overall experience? And that is where I think the real opportunity lies, in this collaboration between privacy, marketing, CX teams, IT teams, and the like.
Where are we in that journey? Would you say, pretty early in folks thinking about this? Like, is there good examples out there? Or?
There are definitely some good examples. I do think that we're at this unique time, and it's going to accelerate because of kind of what I alluded to before, right? You have marketing trying to navigate future-proofing for third-party cookie deprecation, and you have privacy trying to navigate certainly like 2023 readiness for us here in the US, but just how do you reconcile these different requirements across jurisdictions? And so that's kind of forcing a discussion, to your point about, am I really going to offer this right to someone in California but not someone in New York? And so I do think that increasingly we will see those start to come together. So I think that this is the year. I think this is the year we see it accelerate, but there are definitely some early adopters for sure.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks, Ariel. Steph, what do you think on this ways to reinvent the preference center, or there's opportunities to hear from the consumer perhaps?
Yeah, so I think this comes back to being transparent about, the data that they're collecting on consumers, and also the options that consumers have. So things like, the communication preferences is one thing. Another area I'm seeing a lot of interest in for marketers is this idea of zero-party data, where you're essentially asking consumers to volunteer more data about themselves. And what I love about zero-party data is it is inherently transparent because it's volunteered. So an example of this would be, I just had this experience recently. I signed up for a retailer's newsletter, yes, to get the 15% off coupon that they offered me. But it also asked, after I submitted my email address, which product categories are you interested in? Men's versus women's versus children's, et cetera. And it was a very quick question, but essentially helped them try to personalize, even from step one, that first email I got, as opposed to trying to infer what I was interested in based on how I was browsing the website. So it's the difference between transparent data collection, just volunteer this, versus them essentially eavesdropping on my browsing session to figure out what I was likely to buy. And I think we are starting to see more of those experiences because they're not relying on third-party cookies. You don't have to worry about that piece. And again, it is transparent and the consumer is in control, which means you will probably be on the safe side of privacy regulations. And I think that is the future, is giving consumers opportunities to share information about themselves, as opposed to dropping cookies and pixels and trackers to derive that information, or, turning to data brokers to figure out potentially what someone is interested in.
Yeah, I got you, Steph. It's funny. I'm trying so hard to not talk about the death of the third-party cookie, because I know it's a whole other webinar, right? But I mean, for me at least, we need an explainer on this stuff. Like what's going on in this ad tech environment. Maybe we'll touch on that later, because I think we need that. On the integrated experiences, Ariel, I mean, we're asking for consent on every channel, every device, and we're doing it not at the person level, right? Like it's like, is consent fatigue a thing? I'm hearing the word here and there. I'd love to hear from both of you on that. Like, what are you seeing there? How do we address that? I think you touched on it a little bit already.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only is it a thing, but it's also confusing. Like, this will be the third time I reference the same example, but it's just such a good one. So the Apple change. So now you've created a situation where I may have gone to a website on my desktop, selected my preferences, then I may have gotten that same, an app, right? That is from the same website owner, right? And now because of the interface, of course, the average consumer is going to say, no, don't track me, right? That's the scary thing. It's explained differently than it is in a place where there's more of an ability to provide that awareness, as an example. And so now you have someone that isn't sure. How can anyone be clear on what governs, what selection did they make where? It's just it's not tenable either for businesses. It's also not helpful or clear or supportive of trust and trustworthiness for consumers, and so there's certainly not only consent fatigue, but consent confusion, choice confusion, if that makes sense. And so I think streamlining that is a priority across the board. So even though we see regulatory emphasis on dark patterns and cookie consent generally, there is also an acknowledgement of a need to fix the experience. And so that's where you have things like GPC, global privacy control related initiatives, right? Because there is certainly a recognition that the fatigue is real and the experience is disruptive and needs to be improved.
It's like I see an interesting divergence there in how we talk about data privacy for people. And so we're talking about humans, but then, people don't show up as people on the internet, right? They show up as devices. They show up as different mobile advertising IDs and email addresses and cookies, first and third party and whatnot. And so, for example, one of the things we think the industry really needs is privacy management software or consent management software that can essentially stitch together different devices that belong to different people in a privacy safe way to say, this is Ariel, this is Steph. It's not a collection of devices, and they don't need to consent on every device. And in fact, consent on one device can translate to the others because we're dealing with this at a personal level. And this idea, whatever you want to call it, but identity infrastructure, I think should be key to privacy management.
I'm actually going to push back on that. I think the idea of stitching devices together gets really dicey really quickly. And, my persona when I'm on my work computer is going to be different than when I'm using my personal computer. And whether I want companies to know that those are both me and treat me the same way, that's going to vary brand by brand. I think what does need to change here, though, is this, Ariel said it, cookie banners are just awful. They are the worst customer experience. And I think this approach of we need to get permission as soon as possible really deserves a rethink. And I think it should change. For example, if I'm coming off of a browser, a search engine, I don't know if I'm at the right website. I research a lot of B2B technology companies. Some of them have very startup-y names. I don't know if I'm at the right website. Please don't ask for permission. Give me 5 seconds to see if I'm even at the right place before you try to drop 8 cookies on me, right? That initial, tell us who you are, and then the pop-up of, oh, by the way, sign up for a demo, give us your email address. It's a pop-up under a pop-up under a pop-up. Like, it's just awful. And I know we need permission to drop third-party cookies, but it doesn't say that you need permission from the instant someone hits your website. So it's thinking about privacy, again, backing up to the consumer and what their expectations are and how to build trust with them. It's not going to be demanding their data the second they land on your website.
Right, like wait for web page 5 maybe, right? Before we're like, all right, this person's engaging, maybe now we can ask them. Yeah, exactly, Steph, I'm with you on that one. I think it's let's give people the tools where they can decide this. I mean, identity can be kind of funny. The way we think about it is first-party identity tools that you've responsibly gathered, right? And then give brands the choice to be able to say, how do I want to roll this up? And how do I want to enroll the consumer in rolling these devices together? And not necessarily using, third-party identity graphs and things like that. And so the other interesting point about that is, where do you want to roll this up organizationally? For multi-brand companies, for example, like if you're Nike and you're Converse, do you want the choice to be able to say, well, if they opted into communications with Nike, does that mean they opted into communications with Converse? And how do I make that decision? And do I have the tools to be anywhere in that spectrum to either say I want it at a Nike level or I want it at a kind of global parent level? I think people I think tech needs to exist to give people those choices, right? Brands and consumers. So let's talk about data utilization. We started to go there. We know marketers care about data. How do we collaborate with marketing teams? In our conversations with legal stakeholders, the thing that's coming up a lot is they're saying, I want to say no less often. It's like I feel like I'm the department of no. You can't do that. You can't use that. So how do legal teams say yes more often? How do we reconcile teams within organizations that want to use data and perhaps others that have a compliance perspective around it? Steph, you've got some interesting kind of perspectives here on what you saw in GDPR and other places. Can you share that a little bit?
Yeah, so when I'm talking to marketers about privacy, I always tell them you need to get involved with your company's privacy program. There are too many marketers who sit on the sidelines, and this goes both ways. For those of you who are part of your company's privacy team, please include your marketers, because when you don't, this is what happens. Right before the GDPR, we were getting calls, and I mean right before, like the week before May 25th, we were getting calls from marketers saying, my legal team just ripped out this piece of my tech stack. What do I do? How do I replace it? They've basically blown apart my marketing program. And you can see here, right, after the GDPR, about a third of marketers had to change at least one marketing vendor, and 31% had to change at least one advertising vendor. And again, a lot of this was not willingly. It was the legal team, the security team swooped in and made this decision. And this is why I always push marketers to get involved. JJ, if you flip to the next slide, this is happening again with data deprecation, which is the loss of third-party cookies, the rise of walled gardens. It's the Apple's app tracking transparency framework. It's all of these things, once again, changing marketers' tech stacks. And just so we're clear, changing a vendor in your tech stack is a huge hassle. You have to learn the new tool, obviously. You've also got to port all of that consumer data over. It's an ordeal. And with data deprecation, again, it's one of those things where marketers need to be involved in privacy. It needs to be something where they can represent the consumer's perspective, because they are on the front lines of trying to interact with and engage with consumers. And also, they are doing things. If you see this last data point, 64% of B2C marketers are going to invest in more first-party data collection. And so it's important to not just swoop in from the privacy angle and say, that's bad, right? Again, marketers are not anti-privacy. Privacy and data are not at opposite ends of the spectrum, but instead working together on how to build a data collection strategy that is not only compliant, but again, helps engender trust with customers and reinforces privacy as a brand value.
Thanks, Steph. It's funny, like we've been trying to ask CMOs to jump into these conversations more. And this has been a useful data point. Hey, someone's going to turn something off that you care about. If you're not jumping in the conversation, I think it's a good reason to collaborate. Data, I think, is this huge thread, right, between marketing and privacy teams. I mean, and you touched on this, Steph. I mean, the moves that big tech is making around privacy is just causing brands to just go on this rampage of collecting first-party data. Privacy added to this already complex marketing data ecosystem. Steph, I mean, how do you feel about, is big tech weaponizing privacy? Like, is that, how is that battle shaping up, and how do we make sense of it?
That is a really meaty question. I could probably spend an hour on that alone, but what I will say is it's like a tug of war. I mean, big tech there was an ability for consumers to say, I care about my privacy, please do not track me. And that was the do not track mechanism. And the big tech companies just said, actually, we're not going to pay attention to that, right? And it just was rendered completely useless. And so now you have much more forceful things like Apple and just the power it has over its users to do things like introduce a new pop-up that is, to Ariel's point, not worded very nicely. It says, do you want the app to track you across websites and apps, right? It sounds creepy in the prompt. So no, consumers are not going to just hit yes blindly on that. So it's one of those things where you can be at the mercy of the big tech companies, and unfortunately a lot of brands are, or you can try to get ahead of them by really thinking about how to build a privacy program that is forward-looking and that is future-proofed. And that means things like embracing data minimization, which is a very foreign concept for many marketers, because we've had, I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but we've had consumer data readily accessible for decades. And to now suddenly have these restrictions from the tech standpoint, from the regulatory standpoint, is throwing a lot of marketers for a loop. And, I can't blame them, but the reality is Apple has shown that ATT, this little pop-up, is not the end game for them, right? They keep iterating on, for example, the third-party cookie blocking in Safari. They carved out a little sort of not loophole, but an acceptable use for ad measurement, and they keep iterating. The cookie blocking gets stricter and the timelines change. This is not a one and done. And so unfortunately, yes, marketers are going to be taken along for this ride based on the decisions that Apple, Facebook, and Google put out on how data can be used and collected. But really, it comes back to how to meet consumers' privacy expectations and how to build a privacy program that consumers can understand and interact with.
Yeah, gotcha, Ariel. Any thoughts down there? You field questions on this every day, anyway.
Oh, you're on mute, Ariel.
Yeah, so actually on that point, I was going to say, I think that this is an important area of opportunity for those on privacy teams as kind of a way to demonstrate the importance of partnership with your marketing partners, right? Because a lot of these changes, you really need to unpack to understand what's behind them. Are they truly being driven by regulatory changes, in which case you can expect to see them scale across to other platforms, and so the early insight is helpful. In other cases, there's some amount of benefit to the platform. So if we take that Apple app tracking transparency example, I know we've both Steph and I have talked about the prompt being scary, right? At the same time, when it first rolled out, the way that you control the ability for Apple to use your information for ad personalization was in a different place. It was positioned like that. Can Apple use my information for ad personalization? And it really wasn't, it wasn't under the same tracking heading, which also goes to show the power the power of the design of these experiences and the language that's used. And so I think that this is a really important area for privacy to engage with their marketing partners, right? It coming together on these things can help both sides be prepared. And this is just such a complex and nuanced space, and really requires that collaboration, because big tech is positioned differently. Not everyone's taking the same approach. For Apple, it's been this position of we are privacy protector, right? And that has obviously translated to commercial benefits for them. And at the same time, everyone's stakeholders are different. So for Facebook, the approach has been more, we are supporters of small business, and these changes are harmful to them. Google, of course, given their size, is trying to appease all sides by playing a really proactive role in charting a path forward, so it's a very nuanced space, and it's certainly an area that really demonstrates the importance of that collaboration between privacy and marketing teams.
Yeah, Ariel, it's so multidimensional, this idea that data is a thread between marketing and privacy. I mean, you touched on one of those. I mean, the other one is privacy management itself is becoming more data-based. And I think this comes from some of the Forrester conversations we've been having, Steph, with you and Enza and others. Privacy management, when we had to react to GDPR, we reacted quickly, right? And it was somewhat defensive, it was somewhat reactive. And a lot of surveys, a lot of paper-based compliance is what some folks call it. And now we're moving to more data-based compliance. What does that mean exactly, right? Like often a first step in privacy management is to understand where your sensitive and personal data is. And we're talking about doing that efficiently, right? We're not talking about a manual survey where you ask everybody what data they're using. We're talking about actual data discovery technology. And one of the things we're seeing, which is becoming important here, is that data discovery software needs to be integrated with privacy management software. That needs to be the same thing, so that when you understand where data exists in your organization, you can very quickly develop your privacy impact assessments, your DPIAs and whatnot. You can very quickly fulfill subject rights requests. You can very quickly report up to the board. Right? We're seeing more and more that privacy is a board level issue. Right? We're seeing chief privacy officers report at a board level or CEO level. Other times they're reporting into CIOs. So I think these are some concepts, in addition to automation, where it's just going to be core to privacy management tools, at least how we're thinking about it as well at Ketch. And Ariel, you mentioned this earlier, right? Like if you think back to the old days of media buying, it was paper-based insertion orders. You had to literally curate a digital ad onto your website, kind of stitch it in there, right? Program it in there. And then it became programmatic. To your point, Steph, that you made, we almost became too good at that, right? It kind of raised the creepiness factor. And so one of the things we've been thinking about a lot is, how do you make privacy programmatic? How do you make it so that the data you're using as it flows across the ecosystem is privacy safe, has the right privacy choice attached? We all saw the kind of recent controversy with TCF. I think a standard will emerge at one point. That's a whole other webinar as well. But Ariel, maybe you want to say a couple of words. Like, what are you seeing in terms of modern privacy management tools? Like, where do you see that going?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first foundational component is the need to be adaptable easily to different jurisdictions, right? And to be able to make those changes relatively quickly. I think initially that may not have been the case. It might have been easier to set a global standard or find a common denominator, but this isn't about choosing the most stringent. This is about nuanced requirements that truly vary by jurisdiction. And so I think that's one core part of things. The other piece, again, is the experience design needs to be flexible as well. It's not only about the options given to people, but the experience needs to be designed in alignment with how the brand wants the experience to be designed, to the point of thinking about this more holistically and from a more human perspective. That's very important. And then the last kind of foundational element that I would say is CMPs have worked differently. Some are just collecting preferences, others are triggering things to happen, scripts to fire or not, right? And there are different integrations that can happen therein. It's increasingly critical. The data flows in the digital advertising ecosystem alone are very complex, and it's just not workable to think that you'll be able to manage rights and preferences in any way, but to have an integrated and streamlined and automated approach moving forward. So I think that is going to even more so than it already has gained traction, because increasingly there's going to be a need to transmit signals in some consistent way to downstream partners.
Ariel, I think we must have touched some kind of third rail here, because we just got a flood of questions, and I think we can address some of these. I didn't want to get into the TCF thing, but somebody asked, and I know you kind of know a lot about this. How significant is this recent decision on TCF by the Belgian Data Protection Authority over the GDPR violations at TCF? And I know that's still in flux, but do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly significant, but it's also not final, right? So there's a 6-month timeline to remediate the findings, with an action plan being required within 2 months. And so really, ultimately, we need to await the results of that. If it's not found to be satisfactory, if the steps taken to remedy are insufficient, that could have drastic impact on the programmatic ecosystem and the digital economy in Europe. So today there are limited alternatives to that as a framework for operationalizing the transmission of consent signals across the programmatic supply chain. So it has the potential to have major impact, but it is early to tell. And of course, I'm sure there will be a lot of effort to remediate those findings.
Thanks, Ariel. And here's another good one relevant to this slide. Are you seeing clients prioritizing data mapping, data discovery, and privacy within consumer acquisition initiatives?
Yeah, so I would say it's February 3rd. So if I were to place a bet, we will see a ton in about 2 weeks. Because I think it's just early days. We certainly anticipate that there's going to be a ton of these exercises. We've been supporting clients on a handful of them to date to understand, their media data and tech partners practices. But it is just early in the year. I certainly think we're going to see a lot of that happen. I would anticipate that everyone that we work with is going to be doing that ahead of next year. And I think that the inventorying process to the point about, how do we, what triggers it? Is it a loyalty program, et cetera? There's also the need to enhance prior inventories to account for newly created categories of sensitive personal information across different states. So we're certainly going to see a lot of activity in terms of brands looking to refresh their inventories and their mapping, and going, I would say, a level deeper in understanding partner practice. And that's really what we're preparing to support our clients with.
Thanks, Ariel. Steph, this one might be for you. Given the zero-party data, is cookieless marketing a thing we can expect to come up within the next few years? What does that mean for classic marketing?
Yes, it's already happening. So Google Chrome gets the most press because they are the biggest browser, and they've delayed deprecating third-party cookies until 2023. But Apple and Firefox are already blocking them, as is Microsoft Edge and, of course, Brave. If you're a privacy person and using a privacy browser, you're not going to accept third-party cookies. So what that means for marketers is, and this is what I remind them, just because Chrome is pushing back the deadline for when third-party cookies will die does not mean you have got time and can think about, what are we going to do next year? This is a problem for future me. Realistically, we've got consumers who are using browser extensions like Privacy Badger, AdBlock Plus, et cetera, to block third-party cookies because they don't like being stalked across the internet. And obviously, as a privacy researcher, I totally understand and share that sentiment. So when I'm talking to marketers today, it is an acknowledgement that this attitude of third-party cookies not being acceptable is growing, and trying to map out what the future is moving forward. It has huge implications for advertising in particular. Ad targeting and retargeting becomes much, much harder. And so that piece of the puzzle, I don't think has been solved. There are multiple, ad tech players who are trying to work on consent-based alternatives to the third-party cookie. But yes, cookieless marketing is coming sooner than we think. And marketers I'm talking to today are actively working on not necessarily alternatives to the third-party cookie, but what marketing looks like without cookies, period.
Gotcha. Thanks, Steph. There's one more question on the European Union Digital Markets Act, but I think we've got one more slide. Let's do that, and we'll kind of wrap up some of these questions. It's another math lesson, unfortunately, but Ariel, we worked on this case study together. Do you mind talking about how do we put the numbers behind data utilization and privacy?
Yeah, and I would say just to preface this one, because I always preface studies like this. When we think about data utilization and increasing data utilization, we're also mindful that it cannot be at the expense of meaningful choice and transparency to people, right? So saying alone that you were able to decrease the opt-out rate is not a meaningful metric if it's not done with transparency and choice to consumers. So with that said, in this particular situation, we were working with a brand that they had a CMP that was pretty rigid, and basically when that CMP rolled out an experience to solve for some of the CCPA rights, it was there were no real options for configuration. So basically the experience that someone had was the first thing they saw when they went to this website was, pop up, do not sell, or okay. And the do not sell was a tick box. So they're like, yeah, okay, don't sell. That's a little creepy. I just got here. And then, okay. And then right. So, and it wasn't customizable by jurisdiction or anything like that. So you can imagine the opt-out rates were very high. There was no ability to explain anything. It was the first thing that someone saw. And if they weren't clicking it because it was scary, they would certainly click it because it's disruptive, And so what we found was that by implementing a solution that enabled greater choice to people, and at the same time redesigning like the entire transparency approach to be more human, to give more explanation of what's happening to the information and how to manage preferences and what these things mean, the opt-out rate was reduced. Again, I'll underscore, it's not only about the increased ability to utilize data. It's also about that foundation of trust that is built with the person that now isn't coming to a website and seeing and having the first thing they see be do not sell or hit okay or maybe both.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel. Big bucks there. Well, we answered some of the questions. Let's top 3 takeaways. Right. So what are they? And if we have some time at the end, we'll answer some of these questions that are there. But the top 3 takeaways left from my perspective here: articulate the value of privacy for marketing teams. There's opportunity in building brands. There's opportunity in building and thinking about carefully the consumer experience, and of course, data utilization. I think framing privacy, and there's a question about, kind of where do you start engaging with marketing teams, and this might be the place. Privacy as a consumer experience issue. There's so many tips and tricks that Steph and Ariel, you were kind of sharing a little bit. Lots of opportunities to work together on privacy initiatives where consumers understand this value exchange with brands and trust you with their data. And then lastly, privacy safe data utilization. Let marketers do what they want to do with data, but do it in a privacy safe way, I think is key to aligning with some of the teams. Some of the other questions we have here, actually, Jen, do we have time to address some of these, or we're kind of running up to time here?
We're kind of running up against, we're up against the hour almost, but if you want to take one more, we've got time.
Okay, how about where does privacy sit in the organization? I think we talked about this a little. We're seeing it roll up to the CEO often. CIOs and CISOs, right? Tech teams will be emerging as big buyers. I read this morning, data privacy is an enterprise IT tool, not a legal tool. Any thoughts there, Ariel, Steph?
Yeah, I kind of opened with the fact that like my role sits on the business side, right? And I think we're going to see that increasingly. I also think that there are different approaches that make sense for different organizations. So a lot of this will vary, and I think we'll continue to see that vary. I don't think there's going to be one standard place where privacy lives. The important part is that privacy involves collaboration across stakeholder groups. And as long as that's in place, there's the foundation of a constructive privacy partnership.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel. Ariel, Steph, thanks so much for your time today. I learned a lot, absolutely. A lot to think about as well that I hadn't thought about before. So I appreciate it. Jen, over to you. And thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, and thank you, Jonathan, Ariel, Steph. Thank you so much, and obviously thank you, Ketch, for sponsoring today's program. If you would, as a reminder, the program recording as well as the link for downloading today's presentation slides will be posted on the IAPP website within 48 hours in your My IAPP portal. We've dropped a survey link in the chat, so please do take a moment to just click over and do that. It should open a separate window. It should not take you more than 2 minutes. We'd love to hear from you. You could switch one more time, Jonathan. As a reminder, all certified privacy professionals will automatically receive CPE credit if they register through our site. If any attendees are seeking CLE credits, you'll need to apply in your particular jurisdictions. And if you need help with that or supporting materials, feel free to contact one of our IAPP customer service representatives, and they will be happy to connect you with our colleague who specializes in CLE credits. One last time, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope to see you on another IAPP program soon. Have a great rest of your day. And with that, I will take us to a program close.